The letter was not dramatic. That was the first thing I noticed. No thick envelope, no wax seal, no calligraphy. Just a folded piece of notebook paper with my name written on the outside in blue pen. Claire's handwriting. The kind she used when she was being careful. Not her grocery list scrawl, not the loopy cursive she used signing birthday cards. This was slow, deliberate, like she had written my name and then sat with the pen still in her hand for a little while before she put it down. She was sitting on the kitchen floor when I found her. Not the couch, the floor. With her back against the cabinet under the sink, her knees pulled up, still wearing her coat like she had come home, made it as far as the kitchen and simply stopped. There was a mug on the tile beside her that she hadn't touched. The tea bag was still in it, string dangling over the edge. She had been crying recently, not in the middle of it when I walked in, but recently enough that her eyes were red and her cheeks were still shiny in the way they get when someone has been wiping their face with their sleeve. I said her name, she looked up. And then she held out the letter. My name is Daniel Reeves. I am 29 years old. I am a data analyst for a logistics company in Portland, Oregon, which means I spend most of my days turning numbers into patterns and pretending the patterns are more interesting than they are. I am decent at parallel parking, terrible at confrontation, and apparently capable of living with a woman for 2.5 years without ever saying the one true thing that needed saying. Claire Nakamura was my roommate, present tense until that Thursday in October. Past tense in every definition that actually mattered, because Claire had been a lot of things to me before she was ever my roommate, and none of those things fit neatly into the word roommate, which is a word that means practically nothing when the person it describes is also the one you tell about your nightmares, the one who knows how you take your coffee without asking, the one you rearrange your whole Friday around just because she mentioned she had a hard week. We had met 3 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday party, where the playlist was aggressively bad, and everyone was pretending to enjoy it. Claire had been standing near the window with a cup of something she wasn't drinking, watching the room with the expression of a woman doing quiet math about how long she had to stay before she could leave without being rude. I recognized the expression because I was doing the same math. I introduced myself by asking if she had worked out the answer yet. She said 22 more minutes minimum because Jade would notice if she left before the cake. I said I'd gotten to 18, but I might have been generous. She handed me her untouched drink and said I looked like I needed it more than she did. We stayed 3 hours past the cake. The roommate arrangement came later, about 6 months in when her lease ended and my apartment had a second bedroom and the rent had gone up enough that splitting it made complete practical sense. That was what we told everyone. That was what we told ourselves. The truth, the version I only admitted at volume in the dark of my own bedroom, was that I had suggested it because I could not think of a single good reason to see her less. So she moved in. And life became the ordinary, dangerous thing it becomes when someone you love is suddenly also someone who leaves their rain jacket on the hook beside yours and knows which drawer the scissors are in. 2.5 years of that. 2.5 years of shared grocery lists, of dividing the last of the coffee and calculating who owed the next bag, of watching shows we both pretended were just okay while staying up until 1 in the morning to finish them. 2.5 years of her sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her laptop open, and her reading glasses slightly crooked grading papers, because she taught high school English and apparently high school English teachers had a quantity of essays that violated something in the Geneva Convention. 2.5 years of borrowing each other's umbrellas, and returning them eventually and hearing her laugh from the other room, and feeling something in my chest go quiet in the best possible way. I told myself it was comfortable. I told myself that was what good roommates were: comfortable, easy, uncomplicated. I am not a good liar, but I had been lying to myself for so long that I had gotten reasonably proficient. The thing that cracked the arrangement was not dramatic either. That seemed to be a theme with Claire. Nothing she did was ever dramatic in the expected way. She didn't announce things, she didn't make scenes. She registered change through small, quiet signals that you would only catch if you knew her well enough, and I knew her well enough, which made what was happening over the fall all the more impossible to miss. In September, she went on 3 dates with a man named Marcus who worked in architecture and had opinions about coffee beans that she recapped to me each time with a kind of careful neutrality that I was not brave enough to examine too closely. She never said whether she liked him. I never asked, which meant we were both lying in the same direction and neither of us wanted to be the one to turn on the lights. After the 3rd date, she came home earlier than expected and made tea and stood at the counter for a long time without saying anything. I asked how it was. She said fine and went to her room. The next morning she told me she wasn't going to see him again. I said okay and poured her coffee and left it on the counter because that was what I did, and she didn't explain and I didn't ask because asking would have required being honest about why I was relieved, and I wasn't ready for that sentence. In October, her school offered her a position that would move her to their sister campus in Seattle. Full-time literature track, better salary, a fresh start with the kind of language attached to it that people use when they have decided something already. She mentioned it on a Tuesday night between the end of a documentary and the beginning of me trying to figure out what my face was doing. I said that sounded like a great opportunity. She said she was still deciding. She looked at me for a second longer than the sentence required, and then she got up and put her mug in the sink and went to bed. That was 3 weeks before I came home to find her on the kitchen floor. I want to be clear about what I did not do during those 3 weeks. I did not tell her the truth. I did not say anything real about the Seattle thing. I did not stop going about my ordinary life, making coffee, going to work, coming home, existing in the same apartment as the woman I was in love with while pretending that a job offer 400 miles away was simply a logistical matter for her to resolve independently without any input from me regarding how I felt about the distance. What I did instead was become very helpful in an unhelpful way. I researched Seattle neighborhoods. I bookmarked a couple of good apartment search sites and sent them to her with no comment. I mentioned once over dinner that the cost of living up there was actually manageable and that her salary bump would probably cover the difference. I was being supportive. I was being a good friend. I was being so determinedly reasonable that I nearly convinced myself the tightness behind my sternum every time the subject came up was just general life stress and not something that rhymed with devastation. Claire listened to all of it. She nodded. She said things like probably and I know. She looked at me with an expression I could not decode and that I was too scared to ask about. On the Thursday in October, I had worked late and come home closer to 7 than 6. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it gets when it should have noise in it but doesn't. Claire's keys were on the hook, her shoes were by the door, the lights were on in the kitchen. Everything was home except the actual person. Then I turned the corner and found her on the floor. I said her name. She looked up. And then she held out the letter. Not crying now, just sitting there with her back against the cabinet and her coat still on, holding a folded piece of notebook paper toward me like it was something she needed to get out of her hands before she changed her mind about having written it. I looked at my name on the outside in her careful handwriting, and something in my body understood that whatever was in this letter was not small. The way you can sometimes feel the weight of a room before you walk into it, the way certain silences have a shape. I took it. I did not open it right away. Instead, I slid down the cabinet on the other side and sat on the kitchen floor across from her. Which is not a dignified thing for a 29-year-old person to do, but seemed like the right altitude for whatever this was. Claire watched me sit down. She had pulled her knees tighter against her chest, her hands wrapped around her own elbows. She looked the way she looked after hard things, present still, a little exposed, like all the quick clever words had temporarily gone offline. "Are you okay?" I asked. She shook her head once, then she looked at the letter in my hands. "I should have read it when I wasn't watching you," she said. Her voice was rough. "But I already know what it says and I needed you to have it before I kept going back and forth about whether to give it to you at all." "Okay. Can you just read it? Right now?" She nodded. I unfolded the paper. There was something very specific about the handwriting inside. All lowercase except for my name at the top, short sentences, line breaks where someone had stopped and restarted. I recognized the shape of it. It was the handwriting of someone who had written a thing, crossed it out, written it again, and finally left it standing because they were exhausted by their own revisions. I will tell you what it said, not word for word because those words belong to her, but closely enough that the meaning stays intact. It said she had been trying to make the Seattle decision for 3 weeks without making it about me. She said she knew it wasn't fair to factor one person into a career choice, especially when that person had given her no indication that being factored in was something he wanted. That line sat in my chest for a long second. It said she had gone on 3 dates with Marcus specifically to see if she could convince herself to want something simpler. She said that was unfair to Marcus, who was a perfectly fine person and also unsuccessful, because she had spent most of the 3rd date thinking about the way I laughed at things I found genuinely funny versus the polite version I used when something was only medium funny, and if she was cataloging the differences in a man's laugh while that man was sitting across from her talking about pour-over ratios, she had her answer. She said she was not writing the letter to ask me for anything. She was writing it because she was going to take the Seattle job and she wanted to do it honestly, which meant she could not pack her things and leave without telling me that the reason the decision was hard was not the apartment or the commute or the cost of living or any of the sensible factors she had been pretending to weigh. The reason was me. The reason had been me for a while. The last line said, "I don't know what you do with this, you probably do the kind thing and tell me it doesn't change anything, but I was tired of you not knowing." I read it twice, not because it was complicated, because my brain needed both passes to understand that this was real and not something I had assembled from wishful thinking and proximity. Then I looked up. Claire was watching the wall to the left of my head. She had the expression of someone waiting for a verdict who had already decided to accept it with dignity, and something about that expression broke something open in me. She said quietly, "You don't have to say anything right now." "I know. You can just," she paused, "say you need to think, that's okay." "I'm not going to say I need to think." Her eyes came to mine. "Okay. I'm going to say that I bookmarked Seattle apartment listings and sent them to you with no comment, and I have been lying to myself about what that actually was." The color changed in her face, not dramatically, a shift like someone adjusting the light in a room. I said, "I told myself I was being supportive. I was watching you make a decision about leaving and handing you tools to do it faster, because if I said wait or please don't or this matters to me, I would have had to explain why. And explaining why meant saying a thing I had been not saying for approximately 2 years." Claire uncurled slightly, just her shoulders, just enough that the tightness in her posture lowered by 1 degree. "What thing?" she asked. And even then, even sitting on a kitchen floor in her coat with her eyes still red, she managed to ask it like a dare, like she had just enough edge left to make me do it out loud. "That I'm in love with you," I said, "not newly, not as a result of the letter. In the way where you realize at some point you have been in it for so long you can't find the beginning anymore." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sent me apartment listings." "I know. Real estate links, Daniel." I was scared, I said, and deeply practical in a very cowardly way. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, almost, the kind that comes out when something is genuinely ridiculous and also exactly what you needed to hear. I got up off the floor because my back was registering a formal complaint about kitchen tile. Then I held out a hand. She looked at it, then she took it, and I pulled her up. We stood in the kitchen, not far apart, both slightly ridiculous, her still in her coat and me still holding the letter. The tea on the floor behind her had gone completely cold. The apartment looked exactly like it always did, and nothing in it was the same. Claire looked down at the paper in my hand, then she looked at me. "How long is a while?" she asked, "when you say you've been in it for a while?" I thought about it honestly. "Do you remember the night your sister called and you found out your grandmother had gone into the hospital?" Her expression shifted. "That was 14 months ago. You sat on the couch until almost 2 in the morning and I stayed up with you and we didn't talk much. You fell asleep eventually and I stayed there for another hour just making sure you were okay. And I remember thinking that there was nowhere on earth I would rather be than being the person who stayed up with you." Claire was very still. I said I called it friendship. I told myself that was what people who cared about each other did. But then I drove home from my office Christmas party 2 months later, and the whole way home I was thinking about telling you something funny that had happened. And I realized I had been saving things to tell you all day, like you were the place where the day went when it needed to be stored somewhere safe. And that was when I knew. She pressed her lips together, not holding back a smile exactly, holding back something bigger. "You didn't say anything," she said. "You were my roommate. I am still your roommate. I know that was extremely inconvenient." She did laugh then, a short, unguarded sound, the real kind, and after it her face stayed soft in the way that meant all the armor had come down. I needed to ask the real question, not what are we or what does this mean or any of the broad, impossible things, the specific one. "Are you still taking the job?" She looked at me, a long, steady look that felt like the room making up its mind. "I don't know," she said. "I wanted to take it because I thought leaving was the only way to stop wanting something I couldn't have." "You could have it." Her breath moved. "Yeah," she said quietly, "I'm getting that." "I'm not asking you to stay for me," I said, and I meant it. I needed her to hear it clean, without any pressure in the corners of the sentence. If you want the job, it's a real job and it's a good opportunity and I will help you pack. Even now, after all of this. Especially now, because if you stay, I want it to be because you want to stay, not because I said something on a kitchen floor on a Thursday and you felt obligated. She studied me for a moment the way she studied difficult passages in the books she taught, looking for the thing underneath the thing. And if I want to stay for both reasons, she asked. Because I want the thing I couldn't have and I also actually like Portland and the students I have and I maybe wasn't as excited about Seattle as I was pretending to be. Then you stay for both reasons. That seems too easy. This has not been easy, I said. This took 2.5 years, 3 Marcus dates, a letter on notebook paper and me sitting on a tile floor. None of that was easy. Her mouth curved fair. She pulled off her coat finally, dropped it over the back of a chair with the particular unbothered grace of someone who had just set down something heavier than a coat. I should probably make fresh tea, she said. That one's dead. Probably. She filled the kettle. I got the mugs. We did it the way we had done it approximately 400 times before and it felt entirely different, which is the strangest and most specific kind of wonderful. When she turned around and leaned against the counter waiting for the water to heat, she looked at me with a small look that I recognized, the one that meant she was about to say something real. I wrote 7 drafts of that letter, she said. I know, I could see the line breaks. She smiled. The first one was 3 pages. It was embarrassing. I threw it out. Then I tried to make it shorter and it got mean, so I threw that one out too. The third one was mostly just the word sorry written in different sizes and that seemed like a whole different problem. I laughed for more after that. 4 more after that, and then I just sat down and wrote what was true and stopped correcting it. I looked at her, that's what made it read the way it did, it read true. She glanced down at the letter still in my hand. You can throw that away now. I folded it back up and put it in my back pocket. She narrowed her eyes, Daniel. I'd like to keep it. That is mortifying. It is not, it's the most honest thing anyone has ever handed me. Her expression went somewhere tender that she covered quickly by turning to get the tea bags, but her ears were pink and I had known her long enough to know what that meant. The kettle boiled, she poured. She handed me my mug the way she always did, already knowing that I took it without anything, same as I already knew she took hers with 1 spoon of honey and not 2 because 2 was too sweet and 0 was too sharp. She had told me that once, 1,000 years ago in the first week of living together, and I had never once had to ask again. She sat at the kitchen table, I sat across from her. This was the same table where she had graded 1,000 papers, where I had eaten cereal at 6 in the morning before early calls, where we had shared takeout containers and argued about whether a film we both liked counted as good or just well-made, which were apparently not the same thing, a distinction she felt strongly about. The same table, a different Thursday. So she said, wrapping both hands around the mug, what actually happens now? I thought about all the big ways I could answer that. The speeches, the declarations, the version where I said something polished enough to quote later. Then I thought about the letter, about how the best version of what she'd wanted to say was the one she stopped correcting. Now we go on a date, I said. A real one, not dinner with the implicit understanding that we're roommates and this is just what roommates do on Friday nights when neither of them has other plans. An actual date where I pick you up, even though you live 11 steps away and we both acknowledge what we're doing. She considered this a first date. A first date. We've eaten dinner together approximately 300 times. None of those were first dates, those were practice, we didn't know it at the time. She smiled, very sure of yourself suddenly. I've had 2.5 years of material to work with. I know what you like to eat and which side of the booth you prefer and that you always read the menu twice even at places you've been to before. She pointed at me, that is research, not romance. It can be both. Her smile softened. When? Saturday. She nodded slowly, and until Saturday. I looked at her across the same table we had shared for 2.5 years. Until Saturday, we're roommates who just told the truth. She thought about that, then she raised her mug slightly, to telling the truth slightly past the ideal window of opportunity. I raised mine, to kitchen floors and notebook paper. She laughed and we drank our tea, and outside the window Portland did what Portland always did in October, which was be gray and steady and entirely unbothered by what was happening in our kitchen. There was one more thing that happened that Thursday night that I have not told you yet. After the tea, after we had been sitting at the table for a while with the quiet kind of ease that only exists between people who have known each other long enough to stop filling every silence, Claire looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Or maybe I had seen it before and always looked away fast enough to avoid knowing what it meant. She said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Did you ever almost say it before the letter?" I thought about the honest answer, which took a moment because there were several close calls I had filed away in the category of things that never happened. Once I said, last spring, you got offered a freelance curriculum project and you were on the phone outside accepting it. And you came back inside and you were so happy, that specific kind where you're almost embarrassed by it, like you're worried it'll disappear if you look directly at it. And I was standing in the kitchen watching you try not to smile too hard. She was very still. I started to say something, I said. I got about 2 words into a sentence in my head, and then I thought about how if I said it and you didn't feel the same way, we would never get that version of that moment back. The easy one. The one where you could just come inside happy and I could just be there. Her hands were around her mug, so you didn't say anything. I said, "Nice news." She stared at me, "Nice news." I panicked and chose the most neutral available phrase. She blinked, "Nice news, Daniel." I know. That is the single most anticlimactic thing I have ever heard. I am aware. She set down her mug and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way she did when she was recalibrating. Then she looked back at me. "I had a version of that too," she said, a moment where I almost said something. "Yeah. Your work conference last summer, when you called from Seattle actually, which in retrospect was the universe trying very hard to make a point." She shook her head. "You called because you had a bad dinner with some people you didn't know and you just wanted to talk to someone real. And we were on the phone for an hour, and when we hung up you said, 'Okay, good, that helped,' and you said it like I was the specific person designed to make a hard evening manageable." I remembered that call. I had sat in a Seattle hotel room for an hour talking to Claire about nothing important and felt better than I had all trip. "I almost said something when we hung up," she said, "but then I thought if you wanted to say something you would have by now. And if you had said something, I would have thought the same thing." She gave me a look. "We are both very stupid." We were very careful. Same result, different word. I smiled, she smiled. We sat with that for a moment. So there were at least 2 moments that almost broke things open and neither of us let them, which means we both lost something, some version of the last year that could have gone differently. I would be lying if I said that didn't matter at all. It mattered. There's a kind of quiet grief in realizing you could have had more time. But grief and gratitude can occupy the same space, and I was grateful enough that Thursday to let the grief be small. "What happened to Nice News?" she asked. I looked at her. "I would like to retroactively replace it with something honest." "What would you say?" "I would say I was proud of you, and that I wanted to take you to dinner to celebrate, and that dinner with you was the thing I was always most looking forward to regardless of reason." Her jaw tightened in the way it did when she was trying not to be visibly moved. "That's much better than Nice News. It required 2.5 more years of preparation." She looked out the window. Outside it had started to rain again, the low Portland rain that doesn't perform, just shows up and does its work. Then she looked back at me. "I want to say something, and I need you to not make a joke." "Okay. I have been happier living with you than I have been living anywhere else. Not because you fix things, though you do fix things, and not because you're easy, because you are not always easy." I said her name. She lifted a hand. "I mean, you're particular and you have opinions about the right way to load a dishwasher, and you stay up too late looking at work things on your laptop, and you don't always say when something is bothering you, but you show up. You show up in the specific way I need, and you don't make me explain why I need it. And I want you to know that I knew I was taking a risk writing that letter, and I would have written it anyway." I let the weight of that settle. "Because," she said, "if I left without telling you the truth, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering if you might have said it back." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "I say it back," I said. Her eyes shone. She looked at our hands. "I say it back, and I'm going to keep saying it," I said, "until it stops feeling like something that needed to be brave." She turned her hand over under mine and laced her fingers through. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay. Good." Outside, the rain kept going, the tea cooled, neither of us moved for a while. I need to tell you about Saturday. Saturday was not complicated. It was a restaurant she liked in the Pearl District, a corner table, a candle in a short glass holder. I wore the navy jacket she had once told me made me look like a person who read actual books, which I had taken as a compliment even though I wasn't fully certain it was one. She wore dark green, the same shade as the scarf she'd had since before I met her, and small gold earrings, and she had done something slightly different with her hair that I didn't know how to describe except that I noticed it immediately and didn't say anything about it for the first 20 minutes because I was working up to it like a person with no natural ability to receive beauty gracefully. She called me out on it. "You've been staring at my hair since we sat down." I was going to mention it when I was building to it. She took a piece of bread from the basket. "How much longer did you need?" "Maybe another course." She shook her head like I was a lost cause, and she found this deeply endearing, which I was starting to understand was how she looked at me in general, and which I was going to have to find a way to deserve. "Your hair looks different," I said. "It looks really nice." She touched it self-consciously. "I did something different with it." "I know, I noticed the second I picked you up." She looked at me. "You picked me up from our apartment." I rang the doorbell. "You have a key." I was making a point. Her mouth curved. "About what?" "About the difference between habit and intention." She put down the bread and looked at me with the careful attention she gave to things she was deciding how to feel about. Then she said, "That was actually very smooth." "Thank you, it's the jacket." She laughed, bright and real, and the table between us shrank. We ate slowly. We talked about things we had never talked about before, not because the subjects were hidden but because we had never asked in the particular way you ask when you want the whole answer and not just the manageable part. I asked what she had thought the night she moved in, the very first night, whether it had felt like a good decision. She said it had felt terrifying and right in the same moment, which was how she described most of the good decisions in her life. I asked what the first draft of the letter had said, the 3-page one. She stared at me. "No. I'd like to know." "Absolutely not. Just the first line." She picked up her wine. The first line was the most embarrassing sentence I have ever written. More embarrassing than the one with the multiple sorries. Different kind of embarrassing. That one was pathetic. The first draft was, she stopped, "Ernest." "Ernest how?" She looked out the window, mildly mortified. It started with, "I have been trying to convince myself you're just comfortable." My chest tightened in a good way. "Then what?" Then I wrote approximately 2.5 pages trying to explain what I meant, and it became very clear I did not just mean comfortable, and then I cried a little, and then I made myself a sandwich, and then I threw the whole thing in the recycling. I looked at her across the small table with the candle between us and the window behind her showing wet pavement and orange October trees. "I'm glad you wrote the 7th draft," I said. She met my eyes. "Me too." After dinner we walked because neither of us wanted to go back yet, even though back meant the same place, our place, the apartment we had shared for 2.5 years. There is something different about choosing to extend a night when you have been choosing endings too quickly for too long. We walked 6 blocks without deciding to, just moving and talking with our breath showing faintly in the cold. At some point her arm pressed against mine. A moment later I took her hand. She looked down at it and then up at me with that expression, the one with all the layers. "Is this normal first date behavior?" she asked. "Probably not," I said, "but we're working with unusual conditions." We kept walking. 2 blocks further she said, "I'm not taking the Seattle job." I let that sit for a moment. "You don't have to explain why." "I know, I want to anyway." She looked at the pavement. I realized I was using it as an escape route, not from Portland, from the specific possibility of things not working out with you. I thought if I left first on my own terms for a good reason, I'd never have to find out if I was right about what I felt. And now? She looked at me sideways. "Now I'd rather find out." I am aware that was a risk she was nomming out loud. The possibility that feelings did not resolve cleanly. That roommates who confessed things to each other on kitchen floors were not guaranteed a clean and easy landing. She was not naive. She was one of the least naive people I knew. She understood the shape of things that could go wrong, and she was choosing this anyway, which made it mean something harder and more real than if it had been simple. "I want to find out too," I said, not carefully, "all the way." She nodded. "All the way." We stood at a corner waiting for the light, and she leaned her shoulder into mine, not dramatically, just letting the weight of her settle there. which was a thing she had done 1,000 times before and now felt like it was answering a question neither of us had asked yet. The light changed, we crossed. I want to tell you about the Monday after Saturday. She had an early class. She was up before I was, coffee already made, her school bag on the counter. When I came out, she handed me a mug without turning around and said morning in the particular voice she used before 7, which was lower and less defended than her regular voice. I said good morning. She turned around and for half a second there was a look on her face like she was checking whether Saturday had been real or whether we were going to do the thing where we went back to normal like nothing had shifted. I recognized the look because I had felt the same thing. That brief raw second before the morning confirms what the night promised. I stepped closer and kissed her temple, brief and uncomplicated, the way you do something you intend to keep doing. She exhaled, then she picked up her bag. Don't forget we're out of coffee and it's your turn. I know. And the landlord is coming Thursday for the bathroom faucet. I'll be home by 5. She nodded, then she paused at the door. Daniel. Yeah. I'm glad I wrote the letter. I watched the door close behind her. Then I stood in the kitchen where I had found her on the floor a few days earlier, in the apartment that had been quietly accumulating our combined life for 2.5 years, and I held my coffee and thought about how the biggest things sometimes live in the smallest spaces. A folded piece of notebook paper, careful handwriting, a name written slowly by someone who had been deciding whether to hand you the truth. I took the letter out of my jacket pocket that night. I had folded it again after Saturday, tucked it into the jacket, which she still considered mortifying and I still considered non-negotiable. I read it one more time, not because I needed to, because I wanted to remember the specific shape of the moment before the door opened. The weeks after were not seamless. Let me be clear about that. We had a disagreement in November about the kind of disagreement where you both think you're arguing about a scheduling conflict, and then realize partway through that you're actually arguing about whether one of you is allowed to feel disappointed without the other one explaining it away. She told me I fixed things too fast. I told her she processed out loud and expected me to follow the thread without a map. She said that was fair. I said her point was also fair, and I would work on letting things be bad for a moment before I got out the toolbox. She said she appreciated that. Then she moved the toolbox metaphor forward in ways I had not predicted, which was how most conversations with Claire went. We were not a finished thing. We were a beginning with real history and old habits and a bathroom faucet that still wasn't fixed because the landlord rescheduled twice. We were two people who had built a life under the label of practical arrangement and were now unpacking what had always actually been inside it. By December, she had stopped pretending the apartment was hers and mine with some shared zones, and started saying our couch, our corner of the neighborhood, our particular Saturday morning routine, which involved her reading and me pretending to read while mostly watching her read, which she pretended not to notice and definitely noticed. She called me out on it in January. You're not reading, she said without looking up. I'm resting my eyes on the page. You've been on the same page for 40 minutes. I'm a slow processor. She turned one page deliberately. You're watching me read. I find it restful. She looked up then, rested and fond, a combination that was completely specific to her and completely specific to the way she looked at me. Good weird or bad weird, she asked. I smiled, good weird. She turned back to her book, then stop making it obvious or I'll start timing you. The Seattle campus called her again in February. She told them she had decided to stay. She came home and mentioned it like a weather update, calm and without ceremony. Then she stole the blanket off the couch and sat at the other end with her book. After a while I said thank you. She didn't look up, don't be dramatic. I'm not. You're using your grateful voice. I have a grateful voice. You have about 12 voices and I know all of them. I looked at her, that's a little unsettling. She finally looked up, it's called paying attention. I know, I said, I'm catching up. She smiled, at that, just a small one. Then she went back to the book and I went back to pretending to read mine, and the apartment was warm and the rain came down on the windows the way it does in Portland, like it had nowhere to be, and neither of us said anything else for a while because there was nothing left that needed saying. The letter is in the drawer of my nightstand now. She knows it's there. She never mentioned it again after the first Saturday, which I took to mean she made her peace with it. Or she finds it slightly ridiculous and affectionate in equal measure, which would be completely consistent with how she approaches me in general. I find it useful to know that the most important conversation of my adult life arrived on notebook paper. Lowercase. Blue pen, 7 drafts, 6 of which she threw away. The one that stayed was the one she stopped correcting. I think about that sometimes when something hard needs to be said and I am tempted to revise it into something safer. I think about Claire on the kitchen floor in her coat, holding out a folded piece of paper with my name on it, having finally run out of ways to make the truth smaller than it was. Some things do not improve with revision, some things just need to be handed over. Have you ever found someone telling you the truth exactly when you had given up on it? Have you ever been the person holding a letter you should have written years earlier, or the person who received one and finally understood what they had been pretending not to know? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.